Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. I know it's extremely hot. I actually ate an ice cream. I was worried I got it all over myself, but I managed to avoid that. Just about, I think. So the purpose of today's lecture, I've been told to stay here and I wander around a lot, so this is going to be very difficult for me. The purpose of today's lecture is to introduce you to what it might be like to be in a classroom in Waseda, but also to introduce you a little bit to the subject that I study. So I am an international political economist, but I want to tell you something about what political economy is. And also please feel free to ask me questions at any time, either during the lecture or at the end, if you have any questions about the subject or also about studying here at Waseda. So as an opening question, does anyone here want to try to define what a political economist is? What do I do every day? It's lots of... Okay, I feel like Chandler in Friends. No one knows what he does for a living, right? So I'm going to have a go at trying to tell you guys or give you an answer to this question. So the first thing to say is to try to give you a bit of a historical context. So when political economy was first created as a subject, there weren't distinct fields of political science, of economics, of sociology, of anthropology. Instead, there was this discipline where everybody basically, whether they were doing philosophy, economics, or political analysis, would describe themselves as political economists. And the subject itself evolved with the emergence of the nation state, and also it evolved with the development of capitalism itself. And this brings me close to my home country. So actually my mum is Scottish, so Adam Smith was also Scottish, for those of you that might know. And there's still an important centre of political economy in Glasgow University, where he spent much of his career. Adam Smith, incidentally, as a slight aside, was a very interesting human being. He very rarely left the confines of where he was born, and he once went to London for a 3-year kind of study research trip where he developed lots of his ideas about the operation of the mercantilist system and to develop his ideas about why we need to move to a system of free trade. And what I find kind of amusing about that is he absolutely loathed being in London. He hated it, and couldn't wait to get back to his kind of hometown. But Adam Smith wrote a very famous book. And in that book, he was interested in trying to understand why some nations become wealthy whilst other nations struggle. And he was writing that book at the time when capitalism itself was just emerging as a system of economic, social, and political organization. And that's what makes Adam Smith's book so remarkable. The system of capitalism that he was describing was just beginning to develop. And what he did was try to think about what drove that system, what made that system work. Now, I'm going to ask you guys one more question. Do you guys know, have you guys come across what Adam Smith argued was the most important mechanism that made capitalism such a powerful system? He uses an example from a pin factory. Maybe that might help you. Okay, so Adam Smith described a system known as the division of labor. And the division of labor basically described the increases in productivity that we can realize from specialization. And he used this metaphor of the creation of a pin, which he described as a trifling manufacture, a very simple thing, a pin that posts things on, we don't really have them anymore, right? On post-it boards. But he was thinking about how is it that pins are created so cheaply and in such huge numbers under capitalism? And it's because of the division of labor. And that was really a metaphor for Smith. For the entire system of capitalism, capitalism is driven by the increasing specialization and subdivision of labor. And in fact, his defense of free trade was based on the same idea. Just as we should specialize in trade to increase productivity, so should nations also specialize in trade so that they can realize what he would think of, or what we now think of as comparative advantages. David Ricardo developing that idea. So Smith was writing in a context where he was trying to think about what is it that's making this system of capitalism work. But there was also a social and political context behind Adam Smith's writing. And that was the context known now as the Scottish Enlightenment. But what really Smith was trying to understand was what was it that was making an Act of Union in 1707 between Scotland and England, this kind of first modern free trade area, so productive and so successful? And how could that system be protected against what you might describe as more mercantilist, more militaristic, more violent forms of social organization that had defined the preceding 100 years of European history? So Smith was not just making an analytical assessment of how capitalism worked, he was also making a much broader set of arguments about how we should try to define this new system and how we should come to understand it. Now, when we think about what that system was, actually, David Hume gives us a very nice definition of what it represents. This new system was really where commerce became the reason of state. And every individual, as Smith would put it, relies upon the marketplace for their own survival. So this was the system that he was trying to understand and then defend and think about how best to make it work. And so thinking about these questions, we get this kind of classical perspective from Adam Smith. And really that system is a defense of capitalism, and it's a defense of the system of capitalism against the alternative, a more mercantilist, more militaristic type of society. But shortly after Adam Smith was writing, a very different brand of political economy was developed by Karl Marx. And Karl Marx introduced really a critical perspective on the operation of capitalism. So looking at the system, writing almost 100 years later than Smith, Marx was arguing this system is extremely destructive. And he argued that capitalism would sow the seeds of its own destruction through the inequalities that it produces. And we can still see this narrative, this conflict between those that are trying to defend and make capitalism work more effectively, and more critical perspectives that are challenging and seeking to overturn the operation of the capitalist system inside the discipline of political economy. And there are different camps and there are different perspectives, many of which trace their origins back to these two scholars. Okay. So, the central concerns and considerations of political economy. Here are some of the motivating questions that people like me think about. One question is, what best describes the relationship between states and markets? How do states shape the operation of markets? And conversely, what pressures do markets put on the organization of political societies? So how do we best understand those relationships? Are there different varieties of capitalism? How is Japanese capitalism different from capitalism in America or capitalism in Europe? One way that you might think about this, if you use the analogy of sports cars. So to some extent, American capitalism and the relationship between the American state and the American marketplace is a bit like a Ferrari. It's really fast when it's working, and it occasionally crashes really, really badly. When you think about, say, for example, European capitalism, it's a bit more like a Volvo. There are lots of kind of protective, comfortable mechanisms that try to insulate that system from the forces and the mechanisms and the uncertainties of capitalism. Another question is, how do political institutions work across different nations, across different sectors, across different parts of the economy? So political economists, probably more so than economists, put institutions at the center of their analysis. Going back to Adam Smith, what is it about the institutional organization of capitalism that makes it successful? And how should we change the institutions of capitalism to make them work better? In his case, arguing for a move towards free trade. So that question of the role of institutions is very important and is given more emphasis than you probably would see in a typical economic approach to the analysis of a marketplace. Another important question is, what's the role of ideas in shaping the way that the political economy works? A really classic debate in the context of the history of political economy was the debate between Hayek and Keynes in the interwar period. And what those two very famous economists were arguing about was what was the real cause of the Great Depression in the 1930s. And they had completely different and opposing opinions about this. For Hayek, the origins of the Great Depression were in misguided monetary policies in the early 1920s. In other words, his perspective was that the reason that the capitalist system went so wrong in the 1930s was because states had interfered too much in its operation. Now, John Maynard Keynes took a completely different view of that question. His argument was that actually capitalism is inherently volatile and it can get stuck in periods of very depressive cycles. And the only way out of those cycles is to have more state intervention, not less. And again, you can see that debate continue through the course of the 20th century. So in the immediate post-Second World War period, we entered an era of Keynesian economics, and the power of Keynesian ideas was very powerful. But then, in the 1970s, those ideas got subverted, and to some extent there was a return to Hayek's ideas and the notion that we should reduce the place of the state in the operation of capitalism. And we're going through something like another ideational revolution now. Since the 2008 financial crisis, those free market-based Hayekian ideas have come under challenge, and there's more arguments in favor of state intervention and state control of the economy. Another really important defining question for political economists that again separates them from economists is they are really concerned about the winners and the losers in the operation of the economic system. So distributional questions are at the center of their analysis, whereas economists are often more concerned about the efficiencies of different types of organization. Political economists focus their attention on who gets what, who benefits under this arrangement. Okay. So you can probably tell behind a lot of these questions, there are trade-offs. Maybe in fact there's even a trade-off between fairness and efficiency. And so this is another political economist, Okin, who argued that this is really the core of political economy, is trying to understand what are those trade-offs exactly and how should we think about those trade-offs. So that trade-off between efficiency and equality. And another way of framing that question and that debate is there a trade-off between economic growth and political democracy, or the extension of social rights? And this is another classical question in the field of political economy. Is it the case that the forces that make us politically free also make us economically wealthy? Or is it the case that if you move towards a more democratic system, you're going to put sand in the wheels of the forces that make us wealthy? And this question has been debated and looked at by political economists, both theoretically and empirically, over a very long period of time. And the really important question really is, where do we draw the boundaries between those different domains, between social and political rights and between economic freedoms? Now that may seem like a very intuitive way to pose this question and think about it, but it's not universally accepted. So this is Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen is a very, very famous Indian economist. He's also close to my heart as someone I'm very envious of, because he also went to Oxford University, and at Oxford University is famous for writing the shortest PhD thesis in history. And in the context of his work, Sen really looked at this question of what's the relationship between freedom and economic prosperity. And what he wanted to argue is that actually, when we make people more politically free, we also liberate them to pursue economic goals and economic aspirations, and therefore to better themselves economically. And so when he thought about economic development, he argued that we shouldn't think about it as a trade-off between either first having economic wealth and then perhaps later achieving political and social freedoms. Instead, the aim of society should be to grow these two things together and to promote these two things at the same time. What also Sen was very famous for arguing, and this is actually the core of his PhD thesis, So his PhD thesis, does anyone know what his PhD thesis was on? So Sen was analysing famines and the causes of famines. Now, most people, up until that point in time, had taken the view that famines were really the operation of market failures, perhaps predominantly caused by environmental catastrophes, disasters, and changes. But what Sen actually told us, and what he did in his analysis, was to show that in almost every case of a major famine, there was at root a major political cause. So his argument was that there's never been a famine in history in the case where you have a representative democratic government with a free press. So when we think about the great famines of the 20th century in Ukraine, in China, in North Korea, in even earlier, back into the 18th century, the 19th century in Ireland, what you see is, and the Indian famines of the 19th century under British imperial rule, you see a political elite that's not responsive to the people that they're governing. And when you have that circumstance, the political elite then doesn't intervene to correct the famine and to intervene to correct the market failures that may be superficially causing it. So where you do have political freedoms, you can guarantee economic security. And Amartya Sen uses this as his justification for arguing that these two types of freedom necessarily go together. And our justification for democracy need not be rooted only in what makes us absolutely more wealthy, but also in what guarantees us economic security. Okay. So in a more contemporary context, the kinds of things that you'll get to study if you come to Waseda to study political economy is to think about various transformations and developments in the modern world economy and inside nation states today. So we have just some of the issues that have been very salient in the last few years in political economy on this board. So the first represents AI and what the implications of this technological revolution will be for the operation of economic systems, both the promises and the potential risks. This is a really big area of research. It's also transforming the way that we do research in the field. Another really important question, which follows obviously from the recent COVID pandemic, is thinking about the challenges of globalization and the externalities of globalization, notably in this case, the transmission of diseases across borders, and what states can do to better manage those problems. We also have geopolitical questions. Speaking of today, there's conflict in Ukraine, there's conflict in the Middle East, there's tension and economic conflict between America and China. What are the implications of these geopolitical tensions for the operation of the world economy? How do we make sure that we manage them as well as possible? And what do they mean for the way in which capitalism and political systems are likely to evolve into the future? Finally, of course, we have climate change, the existential challenge of our time. And actually a subject that I've been working on more recently, looking at the way that voluntary carbon trading markets might be used or utilized as a potential solution for those challenges. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to introduce you to were two books that I read when I first went to graduate school. And my PhD supervisor gave me these books, said just read them, see what you can take from them. And the first one is by Albert Hirschman, and it's called Exit, Loyalty and Voice. Now, what Hirschman was interested in thinking about is, what do we do in response to the decline of organizations? So you guys can imagine this in your own lives. Maybe you have a problem inside your family. Maybe you have a problem inside your circle of friends. Maybe you have a problem with Starbucks' new coffee. Maybe you have a problem at your high school and the way that a teacher is behaving or operating. What do you do in those circumstances? Now, what Hirschman did was tell us that really we have three choices. Now, you might add one more to these. I'll ask you what one more you might add to these in a moment. But one option that we have is to exit. We can leave that context, take ourselves somewhere else, vote with our feet, if you like. So if we don't like Starbucks coffee, we can go to Tully's, for example. If we're sick of our high school teacher, we can go to another high school. If we really don't like our country, maybe we can emigrate. So I didn't do that, by the way. I still like the UK. But we have options sometimes to exit. But you probably can already tell those exit options aren't equal across different contexts. It's very difficult to exit our families, for example, and to leave our countries. It's very easy to go to Tully's rather than Starbucks. The other option that we might have is to voice our discontent and try to change the operation of that system. So, for example, we might say, we're so unhappy. I'll let these guys come in before I continue this bit. In the meantime, does anyone have a question? No. Do you guys want to find a seat? Are you okay? Okay, no problem. Okay, so for those of you that just came in, I'm introducing two books that were very important to me and given to me when I first went to graduate school that tell us about what political economy is and how political economists think. One of those books is Albert Hirschman, and he was thinking about how do we respond to pressures when we face organizations or we're stuck in organizations that we don't think are working. So as well as being able to exit, we might also be able to voice our discontent, to protest, to launch protest movements, to launch complaints, to lobby for Starbucks to improve its coffee, to lobby the government to lift its COVID restrictions, to lobby the government, for example, to restructure or change the way that taxes are distributed. So another option we have is to exercise our voice. And again, our voice and our capacity to exercise voice is going to be contingent upon the context that we're in. In some places, we may have very little power to exercise our voice. And some people obviously have more power to exercise their voice than others. The next option is loyalty. We might actually do nothing and stay loyal to the institution that we're stuck in for one reason or another. So we might not try to protest to change it. And we might also not exercise our power to leave it. We may just say, okay, I'm committed to this organization. I'm committed to this structure, so I'm going to make it work. Lots of family relationships you can think are really rooted in those bonds of loyalty and the way that we pay costs. I'm sure all the parents in this room will know what it means to be loyal to your children, like almost without limit, right? So those are loyalties that mean that we're not going to exit. And we're going to restrain our voice when we want to maybe use it sometimes because we're thinking about the best interests or the relationships of loyalty in a certain context. So in those cases, you may even defend the failing organization, defend it against external critics, for example. So the important point of Hirschman's analysis is that these are often alternative choices for us. And what's really interesting is that they really map onto, very broadly, the distinction between politics and economics. Inside what we might describe as political marketplaces, essentially, we tend to not have very many exit options. So our choices are often either loyalty or voice. Our capacity to leave is often constrained. In contrast, when you think about economic marketplaces, our exit power is very, very high. We can quite easily leave a job that we don't like, go onto the job market and find another job if we're frustrated. This changes the operation of political and economic markets. It makes them fundamentally different. And that's what Hirschman was interested in exploring and thinking about. So to give you one concrete example, which I think is particularly interesting, in the context of the application of this framework, when we think about the existence of private education and whether it's good or not inside a national education system to also have private schools. This is a very important debate inside education policy, and it's a very long-lasting question. Now, those that advocate in favor of the existence of private education say that what private education does is create competition between schools that drives up standards. In other words, the fact that there's an exit option is a good thing. What critics of private education systems say is that what effectively happens is you take the parents with the most resources and the highest aspirations for their children, and you allow them to leave the public education system, draining that system of a powerful source of demand, of voice, of calls for change. So what's then happening inside that system is it's allowing those public schools to operate less efficiently and less effectively, because you're giving people an exit option where it will be better not to give them one. This gives you one example of the stakes involved in the application of this framework. My other and even more favorite book is a book by Ronald Coase. Ronald Coase was a British economist. He won the Nobel Prize for Economics eventually when he was in his 90s, early 90s. He lived to a very old age, well over 100. But he actually won the Nobel Prize, and this is why I think it's inspiring, hopefully, for some of you guys, for work that he first started as an undergraduate student. Now, Coase, when he was an undergraduate student, he was studying at the London School for Economics, and he went on to graduate studies there, and he continued to ask the same question. When he was there, he went to America on a research trip, on a sabbatical leave, if you like, or I don't know, a study abroad program. And he was allowed then, or when he was in America, he started to speak to business people, the owners of these corporations in America on the West Coast, basically the leaders of, or the champions of American industry. And when he was looking at the operation of the American economic system, Coase then looked back at his economic textbooks. He said, something's not right about my textbook, because my textbook tells me that most transactions should happen in markets because markets are so efficient and they allocate resources so effectively. But when I go to the center of the capitalist system and I look at it, most transactions take place inside firms. So if you're an alien looking down at the capitalist system and you had a textbook telling you how efficient this economic system is because of the efficiencies of the market, and then you realize that almost all of the transactions happen in these huge hierarchical organizations, you might wonder if there's something wrong with the textbook or if you've arrived at the wrong planet, right, to analyze. And that's exactly what Coase thought to himself. Why do firms exist? And he asked himself this question. And the answer he gave was extremely elegant. He basically said, the reason firms exist is because, does anyone know the answer to this? I wouldn't expect anyone to. But it's because there are costs to using the market, what he called transaction costs. There are costs to making contracts, to enforcing those contracts, to enforcing the operation of economic transactions. And sometimes it's better to internalize those costs inside a hierarchy. The easiest example to make sense of this is, if you imagine that you're a construction company responsible for building houses, one way that you could find your labor is to actually go into the marketplace every day and negotiate with the laborers. This actually has happened and does happen in some contexts even today at the margins, so that you can basically hire labor on a daily basis. But it's very difficult to be a construction company operating in that context. It's going to cost you a lot of energy and time to go into the marketplace, to make those contracts with laborers every day, to negotiate a price with them, to negotiate the terms of when they're going to take their lunch break, how long they need to work for. It's going to create a lot of uncertainty and frictions and costs in your business. So in that context, it may well be cheaper and more efficient to internalize those costs, to bring those costs inside your own company, thereby creating a hierarchical relationship between yourself and that employee. So building those relationships and bringing them inside a hierarchy explains the existence of firms. Now, Coase presented that, and he wrote actually a very small number, but each one was brilliant. One other really brilliant paper in 1967, later in his career, and he won the Nobel Prize for those two ideas. But the main thing to take from Coase is that you are perfectly allowed to ask what are seemingly naive questions, Another thing is, don't trust the academic field that you're in to be necessarily a good judge of the brilliance of your ideas. It took a very long time for the economics profession to realize that Coase was making a fundamentally important point about how markets work. And just from my own work, I continue to use Coase to think about the way that markets are built and the way that they operate. This discipline of institutional economics, the idea that he created, has spawned an enormous field that lawyers work in, political scientists work in, economists work in, political economists work in. All of us trying to understand the way in which institutions shape the operation of different types of economic organization. So thank you so much for your attention. Please feel free to ask me any questions. I feel like I've asked all one-way questions so far, so please feel free to ask me anything you want, and hopefully I'll see lots of you again at some point in the future. Thank you very much.